The court order was thick, embossed with the county seal, and held in the trembling, triumphant hand of the HOA president. She believed it handed her control of the multi-million-dollar lake I had spent 2 years restoring. But she was moments away from realizing that in claiming the water, she had sealed the fate of her entire community. The air that afternoon was thick with the scent of pine and fresh water, a comforting blend that usually settled the soul. Yet, on this particular day, it clashed sharply with the acrid, metallic smell of desperation clinging to the carefully manicured world of the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association. It wasn't just a tense confrontation. It was the final devastating reckoning in a battle that had spanned nearly 2 years, 22 agonizing months of legal maneuvers, passive aggression, and outright bullying. The core of this epic drama wasn't a structure or a boundary line, or even a petty noise complaint. It was the lake itself, a sprawling, luminous body of water that the protagonist, a man named Alex, had single-handedly dragged back from the brink of ecological ruin. Just moments before, Mrs. Albright, the HOA president and the self-appointed high priestess of neighborhood perfection, had stood poised on the newly installed composite dock. This was Alex's dock, built on what Alex believed was his private water. Her face was a frozen mask of condescending triumph, her posture rigid with self-importance. In her perfectly manicured hands, she clutched a thick vinyl binder, overflowing with official-looking documents, legal filings, and years of accumulated, unchallenged entitlement, ready to deliver the ultimate crushing blow. The story truly began 3 years earlier, not with a roar, but with a whisper of rot. Alex was a man whose career had been spent in the concrete jungles of urban design, but whose soul yearned for the wild symmetry of nature. He wasn't looking for a lakeside mansion. He was looking for a project, a place where genuine conservation intersected with private ownership. He found it listed in a cryptic real estate ad. Seasonal pond and ancillary lot. Requires vision. The reality was far bleaker than the ad suggested. What had once been a pristine, spring-fed lake, dubbed Old Man's Watering Hole by the locals, was now a stagnant, algae-choked, mosquito-infested depression. It had been systematically drained over decades by the upstream residential development, which diverted its flow for irrigation and then slowly choked by invasive species and accumulated residential runoff. The property he bought was a forlorn, crescent-shaped wedge of land, 20 acres in total, encompassing the entire southern bank and, crucially, the entire lake bed, except for the narrow, 6-foot-wide riparian strips that bordered the 10 luxury homes of Lakeview Estates. Alex's first visit felt less like a viewing and more like an archaeological dig. Alex saw past the rusted debris, the discarded plastic, and the sickening green film covering the water's surface. He saw the subtle elevation changes, the faint outline of the original, deeper basin, and, most importantly, the barely perceptible trickle of the original Calibeat Spring, struggling to break through the sludge near the western border. His vision wasn't about building a luxury home. It was about reversing 50 years of neglect, restoring the lake to its ecological peak, and creating a private, self-sustaining wetland sanctuary. The initial work was monumental and solitary. Alex moved a simple prefabricated cabin onto the property, preferring to live rough right next to the water, sacrificing comfort for proximity to the restoration effort. His days were spent in heavy waders, pulling out truckloads of debris, manually removing invasive water hyacinth, and installing sediment traps. He spent weeks digging exploratory trenches, tracing the historical flow of the spring system, confirming what the old surveys hinted at. The entire body of water was dependent on that single, subterranean source that ran directly beneath his purchased acreage. As the months passed, the transformation was undeniable. He introduced native aquatic plants, lily pads, arrowhead, rushes, filtering the water. The clarity improved dramatically. The color shifted from industrial green to a deep, earthy blue. Fish returned, carried by birds or introduced carefully by Alex. The lake, now christened Alex's Sanctuary, in his mind, began to draw wildlife. Kingfishers, blue herons, and, thrillingly, a breeding pair of wood ducks. The value of the surrounding properties, which had long suffered from the unsightly stagnation, began to appreciate simply from the beauty emanating from Alex's side of the fence. This success, however, was the very thing that drew the attention of the Lakeview Estates HOA, and specifically, Mrs. Albright. The Lakeview Estates community was the very antithesis of Alex's rugged individualism. It was a place where conformity was prized above all else, where the pursuit of sameness was a moral imperative enforced by a meticulously detailed, 300-page covenant. The homes were massive, identical monuments to suburban wealth, painted in a palette of 10 approved muted colors, each lawn maintained to the exact height of 2.5 inches. Mrs. Albright was the physical embodiment of the HOA's ethos, a retired corporate executive whose only remaining ambition was absolute control over her immediate environment. She treated the Lakeview Estates community as her last, most important portfolio. Her motivation was simple, brutal, and entirely surface level: property values and control. She didn't see a restored ecosystem. She saw an unregistered amenity. The lake had been worthless when it was a swamp, an unfortunate eyesore shared by the residents. But now that it was beautiful, now that it was the focal point that justified their inflated home prices, it suddenly needed to be managed, regulated, and, above all, claimed. The trouble began subtly. Alex's cabin, though meticulously clean and set back far from the common areas, was the first target. It was described in an official HOA letter signed by Mrs. Albright as a non-conforming auxiliary structure, and its cedar siding was deemed not within the approved aesthetic color range: beige, taupe, or dove gray. The letter demanded its immediate remediation or removal, even though Alex's property was clearly defined outside the official boundaries of the HOA's plat map. Alex simply ignored the letter, tossing it into his wood-burning stove, secure in the belief that the HOA had no jurisdiction over land that had never been part of their development. The next letter was more direct, focusing on the lake itself. It wasn't about the beauty of the lake, it was about the native reeds. Alex had intentionally planted a thriving border of tall, filtering reeds and cattails along his boundary line, essential for preventing erosion and absorbing runoff. Mrs. Albright's letter declared these natural plantings to be unapproved vertical obstructions and untamed vegetation, which interfered with the residents' aesthetic visual plane. The demand was clear: mow down the life-giving reeds and replace them with a manicured, conventional grass lawn suitable for the rigid standards of Lakeview Estates. Alex's resistance was measured but firm. He retained a local, slightly crusty but highly knowledgeable property attorney, an old-school lawyer named Mr. Henderson, who understood riparian rights and the absurdity of HOA overreach. Henderson's initial, polite letter back to the HOA board stated simply that the Lakeview Estates covenants and restrictions, CC&Rs, did not apply to Alex's separate, legally defined parcel of land, and that all future communications must cease or be addressed through legal channels. This challenge to her absolute authority was an affront Mrs. Albright could not tolerate. It was the moment she transitioned from petty annoyance to strategic hostility. She convened an emergency board meeting, where she presented her manufactured crisis. The lake, the very foundation of their property value, was being controlled by an eccentric outsider who refused to conform to a single standard. She began the methodical legal groundwork to assert the HOA's claim, searching through their own historical documents for any clause, any loophole, or any old agreement that could be weaponized to seize control of Alex's sanctuary. The legal filing unleashed a tidal wave of bureaucratic warfare. Mrs. Albright, viewing the courts as merely an extension of her HOA board meeting, fully leveraged the association's deep financial reserves. Her strategy was attrition: drown Alex in paperwork and fees until his resolve and his savings were utterly exhausted. The first volley was a series of crippling, fabricated fines. Alex received an official notice detailing a $500 per day fine for the failure to remediate unapproved vegetation, the native reeds. The fines accumulated rapidly. turning a simple disagreement over landscaping into a legal liability that ballooned to tens of thousands of dollars within weeks. This was followed by a fine for unauthorized watercraft launch when Alex used a small, silent, electric trolling motor to survey the water quality, which Mrs. Albright argued was a violation of the No Motorized Vehicles on Common Waters rule, a rule Alex pointed out was irrelevant since the water wasn't common and his motor was electric. The pettiness escalated. The HOA hired a private security contractor, a man named Gary, whose sole purpose seemed to be sitting in a black SUV at the edge of the development, documenting every single action Alex took on his own land. Alex was fined for inconsistent exterior lighting, because the single light above his cabin door was a warm, yellow hue, rather than the HOA-mandated stark white LED. He was fined for improper waste disposal because his composting operation, designed to enrich the lakeside soil naturally, was deemed an aesthetic nuisance. Alex felt the pressure mounting. His attorney, Mr. Henderson, was excellent but expensive. The legal fees consumed his restoration budget, forcing him to halt the planned installation of the critical subsurface aeration system. The constant, documented harassment, while legally flimsy, was emotionally draining. He was an environmentalist, not a litigator, and the war was turning his sanctuary into a siege. He began to understand the core of the HOA's power, the ability to inflict maximum administrative pain at minimum personal cost. The true legal battle hinged on a concept called the doctrine of implied dedication. Mrs. Albright's legal team argued that because the residents of Lakeview Estates had been allowed access to the lake, or rather, its miserable, pre-restoration swamp state, for 20 years for fishing and occasional attempts at canoeing, even though the water was often too low and polluted, there was an implied dedication of the water body as a common amenity, regardless of the specific land deeds. This threat was serious. If the court ruled in favor of the HOA, Alex wouldn't just lose control over his planting and his dock, he would lose the right to restrict public access to the water he had saved, effectively turning his restored sanctuary into a poorly managed community park, open to the very abuse and neglect that had ruined it the first time. Driven by desperation and the realization that his modern deed was insufficient, Alex shifted his focus from the current litigation to historical evidence. He spent 3 weeks holed up in the county records office, ignoring the mounting fines and the ceaseless, silent surveillance of Gary the security guard. He sifted through crumbling microfiche, dusty property ledgers, and forgotten hand-drawn plat maps from the 1920s and 30s. He wasn't looking for his deed. He was looking for the source material, the original land grants and water rights documentation that predated the suburban sprawl. His persistence paid off in a dim, subterranean room filled with the scent of aged paper and dry heat. He discovered the original land parcel belonged to a man named Silas Chalibite, who had owned the entire valley before the surrounding land was parceled out. Critically, he found 2 key documents. First, a 1947 quitclaim deed transfer for the entire Lake Basin land, which explicitly and in no uncertain terms stated that the land, and the riparian rights to the underground spring that fed it, was to remain a separate, privately held entity, never to be dedicated for public use, and that any future adjacent developments waived all claims to the water body itself. This was the brittle sheet of parchment. Second, he found a long-forgotten, hand-annotated 1950s public works map. This map, drawn before the modern municipal water system was fully implemented, showed the precise, high-volume flow path of the Chalibite Spring as it exited the ground on his property and filled the basin. Crucially, it detailed the existence of an old, stone-lined diversion channel and a disused drainage overflow system installed by Silas Chalibite, designed to regulate the lake level and prevent the spring from flooding the valley during high rain. The map included detailed measurements and engineering schematics for diverting the spring flow, allowing the landowner complete control over the water source. Alex felt a cold, calculated clarity wash over him. The HOA was suing him over access to the water. He now possessed evidence that not only confirmed the land was legally his, but that the water supply was his to control and, More importantly, divert, according to the original, grandfathered engineering design of the land. He shared the findings with Mr. Henderson, who, despite his decades of cynicism, was stunned by the clarity of the legal advantage. The lawyer's face broke into a rare, genuine smile. The strategy shifted instantly. No longer were they defensively fighting the fines or the implied dedication. They were preparing for the final, annihilating counterstrike. Alex secured a quiet loan, not to pay the legal fees, but to lease and install the massive industrial-grade pump, the one seen in the hook, along with the reinforced piping necessary to activate the historic diversion system outlined in the 1950s map. This installation, done under the cover of a massive dredging operation on his property, was the final, devastating piece of his defense. The rising action culminated with Alex receiving the final summons. The court had granted Mrs. Albright's request for an injunction, scheduling the immediate seizure of the lake to transition it to HOA management, pending the final declaratory judgment hearing. The time for paperwork was over. The time for confrontation had arrived. The day of the confrontation was meticulously staged by Mrs. Albright. She chose a Tuesday afternoon, believing it would ensure maximum attendance from her key allies, the retired committee members with nothing but time and entitlement on their hands. She had coordinated with a local news crew, subtly inviting them to film a piece on community leaders reclaiming green space from negligent private owners, ensuring maximum public pressure on Alex. She stood on the end of the new, pristine dock Alex had built, directly over the water she was about to claim. The HOA's legal team, 3 young attorneys in sharply tailored suits, stood rigidly behind her. The air crackled with her absolute conviction in her impending victory. The court injunction, authorizing the temporary seizure and management of the lake, was the physical manifestation of her power, a document she intended to wave like a flag of triumph. Alex arrived alone, dressed in his worn work boots and faded flannel shirt, carrying only 2 things: the vinyl tube containing the ancient parchment, and a small worn remote control hidden deep in his pocket. He ignored the pointed stares of the crowd and the discreet camera lens of the news crew. His entire focus was on Mrs. Albright, whose every dismissive glance only fueled the cold, righteous certainty that had guided his actions for the past 6 months. Mrs. Albright began her prepared speech, a monotonous, self-aggrandizing lecture on stewardship and the failure of private citizens to respect community assets. She detailed the fines, the contempt, and the supposed hardship Alex had inflicted upon the neighborhood. As she spoke, one of her attorneys formally presented the bulky official court injunction, a thick sheaf of pages bearing the seal of the county clerk, a physical symbol of Alex's defeat. Alex waited, letting the silence after her final, triumphant pronouncement stretch, drawing the attention of every person present. The moment was hers to savor, but the delayed reaction was Alex's to command. He accepted the injunction, the paper cool and heavy in his hand, glancing at the final page that detailed the lake's transfer of control. He didn't argue, he didn't protest, and he didn't even look at her. Instead, he slowly unrolled the brittle sheet of parchment. It was yellowed and cracked, bearing the elaborate copperplate handwriting of a 19th-century surveyor. Alex placed it flat on the pristine white dock railing, using the weight of the court injunction to hold it in place. The crowd shifted, confusion replacing their anticipation. Mrs. Albright, flustered by the interruption to her monologue, leaned forward to read the antique document. The document was not a deed. It was the Waiver of Public Access and Perpetual Water Rights, dated 1947. Signed by every adjacent landowner and filed decades before the Lakeview Estates Corporation even existed. Its archaic language, legally sound and ironclad under state property law, stated that the owner of the basin land possessed exclusive control over the Chalybeate Spring, the only source of the lake, and that all adjacent property owners had eternally relinquished any claim to the water itself, in exchange for guaranteed undisputed access to the surrounding infrastructure. The legal team immediately converged on the document, their faces turning from confident professionalism to dawning alarm. This wasn't a modern legal argument. It was a devastating historical precedent that neutralized their entire claim of implied dedication. The land, and the right to the water source had never, could never, have been common property. Mrs. Albright's face began to flush a dangerous mottled red. This was the moment Alex walked away from the dock, moving toward the cluster of newly planted cypress trees and tall native grasses, the untamed vegetation for which he had been fined thousands of dollars. He reached the dense screening and paused, turning back to face the stunned crowd. Mrs. Albright, finally regaining her composure, started to shriek about forgery and obstruction of justice, the carefully constructed facade of her authority crumbling in the face of history. Alex didn't need to hear her words. His entire focus was on the small, hidden, and expertly camouflaged panel box built into the base of a massive, hollowed-out stump. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the remote control, small and unremarkable. His finger moved to the bright red industrial-grade activation button. The effect was instantaneous and physically jarring. The ground beneath the feet of the onlookers shuddered. A deafening, mechanical roar erupted from the earth beneath the cypress trees, a sound that obliterated Mrs. Albright's enraged shrieks. It was the enormous concealed industrial pump, kicking to life with the force of a small jet engine. This machine, connected to the subterranean diversion system revealed by the 1950s map, was designed to perform the exact function permitted by the 1947 document, to divert the flow of the Chalybeate Spring. Mrs. Albright's practiced smirk instantly dissolved into an expression of pure, paralyzing horror as the lake, her alleged corporate asset, the crown jewel she was claiming for the association, began to visibly, undeniably, and rapidly recede. The water level dropped a visible inch in the first minute, the receding water exposing the muddy, unsightly, and malodorous truth beneath the tranquil surface, a surface she had never once truly seen or appreciated, only coveted. The descent accelerated. Within 10 minutes, the water had dropped over 3 feet, exposing a wide, disgusting ring of black, anaerobic mud around the entire perimeter of Lakeview Estates. The HOA's own hastily installed, aesthetically pleasing but poorly engineered docks now hung comically suspended over a muddy wasteland. The sickening, long-buried scent of stagnant decay and accumulated residential runoff, masked for years by the lake's depth, wafted into the air, reaching the perfectly manicured lawns. The hidden deed proved the land belonged to Alex, but the monstrous pump proved the water was his to manage and control. Without that redirected spring, Lakeview Estates was instantly and permanently reduced to Mud Puddle Hollow. It was the moment the true, irreversible consequences of their collective greed and small-mindedness washed ashore, leaving them standing on dry, cracking mud, clutching a now worthless legal injunction. The news camera, which had been set up to film Mrs. Albright's victory speech, was now panning wildly, capturing the sight of the president of the Lakeview Estates HOA, the self-proclaimed guardian of property values, standing motionless, speechless, and covered in the rising stench of the community's discarded refuse, as her crown jewel literally evaporated before her eyes. The climax ended with the pump's relentless, thunderous roar, a sound that announced the utter, final, and irreversible defeat of entitlement. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, silent only for the continuing industrial thrum of the pump. The gathered homeowners, witnesses to the ecological and financial annihilation of their community's primary asset, didn't scream or argue. They stared, paralyzed by a combination of shock and the increasingly unbearable stench of the exposed lakebed. The news crew, realizing they had stumbled onto a story far bigger than a petty property dispute, began filming the exposed, unsightly mess, a perfect visual metaphor for the rotten core of HOA entitlement. Mrs. Albright's perfectly tailored legal team attempted a frantic, whispered consultation, their faces pale beneath the late afternoon sun. The pump, they realized, was not just a symbol of malice, it was a physical demonstration of a legally defensible right to control water flow, granted by historical documents their cursory due diligence had failed to uncover. The court injunction they held was now moot. It granted them control over the lake, but the lake, by any reasonable definition, no longer existed. They were left with a parcel of foul-smelling, privately owned mud. Alex kept the pump running for a full, torturous hour, The legal fallout was swift and absolute. Mr. Henderson, armed with the 1947 waiver and the 1950s diversion map, filed a motion not only to dismiss the HOA's declaratory judgment request, but also a massive countersuit for harassment, property interference, and the accumulated unlawful fines. The discovery of the documents, which fundamentally destroyed the HOA's core legal premise, forced their expensive outside counsel to concede a monumental defeat. The judge, clearly irritated by the waste of court time caused by the HOA's overreach, not only dismissed the case with prejudice but ruled that Mrs. Albright's campaign of fines and surveillance constituted willful harassment. The HOA was ordered to pay Alex every dollar of the fines they had levied, all of his legal fees, and an additional punitive sum for the deliberate and documented disruption of his personal property and restoration efforts. The financial impact on the Lakeview Estates community was severe. The punitive damages and the accumulated costs of their failed, protracted legal battle drained the association's reserve funds entirely. An emergency assessment was necessary, forcing every single homeowner to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket to cover the cost of Mrs. Albright's failed crusade. The community turned on its leader with the ferocity of a sudden, brutal summer storm. The residents who had quietly tolerated Mrs. Albright's tyranny, who had valued conformity over common sense, were now paying the price for her overreach. The massive, immediate drop in property values, triggered both by the visible stinking mess of the mud pit and the public embarrassment of the news coverage, was the final, devastating blow. Within a week, the Lakeview sign at the community entrance became a bitter joke among the remaining residents. Mrs. Albright was forced to resign in a humiliating, tearful, private meeting that was immediately followed by a public email leak detailing her incompetence and the true cost of her vindictiveness. She became a pariah, ostracized by the very people she had tried so desperately to control. Her own meticulously landscaped house went up for sale shortly thereafter, listing at a significant loss. Alex, however, was left with an empty lake basin and a huge influx of cash. The pump sat silently by the cypress trees, a monument to the power of overlooked history. He had won, comprehensively and undeniably, but the victory felt hollow. He had restored the lake to its natural glory, only to be forced to destroy it to defend his property rights. The power he now possessed was terrifying, the absolute legal authority to decide the ecological fate of the entire region. He could leave the lake diverted, sell the barren, now valuable mudflat for development, and walk away with a profit, leaving Lakeview Estates a ruined monument to their own greed. But that was not Alex's nature. His victory was never about money. It was about the sanctity of conservation and the defense of the land he had saved. After a month of calculated silence, letting the mud bake and the lesson sink in, Alex contacted the new, terrified and highly contrite HOA board. He offered them a single, non-negotiable term for restoring the water flow. The agreement he drafted was a masterpiece of legal and ecological justice. It was a permanent conservation easement and water use agreement, stipulating that the lake would remain private property, managed entirely by Alex. In exchange for restoring the spring flow, the HOA was forced to 1. Permanute all riparian rights, formally acknowledging Alex's absolute control over the lake basin and its water source. 2. Mandate the removal of all chemical fertilizers and pesticides from the HOA's adjacent properties to prevent runoff into the lake basin. 3. Establish a permanent, heavily monitored buffer zone along the entire community border, planting native vegetation to filter contaminants, the very reeds Mrs. Albright had fined him for. 4. Pay Alex a small perpetual annual fee, not for the water, but for his continued ecological stewardship of the restored habitat, a fee that ensured the community would forever subsidize the very man they tried to destroy. The new board, utterly desperate, signed the agreement within 24 hours. Alex, satisfied that the lake would finally be protected from both nature's decay and human pettiness, flipped the switch back. The powerful pump reversed its function, and the Chalybeate spring was redirected, beginning the slow, steady process of refilling the basin. Over the next 3 months, the lake returned, clearer, deeper, and more beautiful than before, a living, breathing testament to Alex's resolve. The homeowners watched in silent awe as the water crept back, washing away the stench and restoring the value they had nearly forfeited. Alex's sanctuary thrived, a private paradise protected by the weight of history and the power of a legally binding defeat. He taught the world a powerful, indelible lesson. The greatest leverage is not found in the rules of the present, but in the forgotten truths of the past, and sometimes, the only way to protect what you love is to possess the power to take it away. It all begs the question, what do you truly own if you don't control the very source that sustains it? And are the petty rules of a small group of people ever stronger than the original, unassailable law of the land? The end.